One of the most interesting teams in the NBA this season, I feel like people aren't really talking about, is the Brooklyn Nets, because not only do they have a nice collection, especially of defensive talent, they have some future assets, but it's possible that Ben Simmons might be back. Now, I'm a Nets fan, and before you come at me and say that I'm being biased or that I'm being too optimistic, there are videos out there on the internet that I made a couple of months ago, they're not hard to find, where I said that Ben Simmons was legitimately the worst player in the NBA last year, amongst guys that actually mattered to their teams, that played 20 to 25 minutes a game. Ben Simmons was the worst player that I watched last year in that volume of minutes amongst guys that people actually care about how they play on a night-to-night basis. He was so unbelievably bad. He couldn't finish at the rim, obviously couldn't shoot free throws, much less try and make a perimeter jump shot. Defensively, he was terrible. He couldn't dribble the ball. I can't describe to you how bad of an experience it was watching Ben Simmons last year, because as a Nets fan, I've been waiting on this guy to look like old Ben Simmons for a while, obviously trying to come back at the end of the postseason series 2 years ago. Then all of last year just never looked good at all. However, it's preseason, and then as the season gets started, I would expect this to continue. We're starting to see some flashes here for Ben Simmons of someone that just really wasn't healthy for the last 18 to 24 months. Obviously, he went through everything that he went through in Philadelphia, and most people just kind of assumed that the back injury, the back issues that he was dealing with were more or less an excuse for why he wasn't on the floor rather than an actual physical injury. But watching him in the preseason, watching him this year, and what I would expect to continue as the year started, is someone that just looks completely different. He looks like Philadelphia Ben Simmons again. There's an athleticism, there's an aggressiveness in terms of getting to the rim. The playmaking is there, and he is such an interesting fit within this group that Brooklyn has, where he starts alongside a handful of other guys that also bring a lot of size and skill to the floor. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, whoever the guard is that's out there, and then Ben Simmons. That's a really, really cool group, and as long as you can figure out the spacing around Simmons and Claxton, or potentially split those guys up a little bit more, this is a really intriguing team, and a team that I don't think a lot of people are expecting very much from this season. And obviously, if you're not someone that's super excited about how Ben Simmons is going to look this season, I don't blame you, because we've seen this before where he has moments, he has flashes, and then it all kind of comes crashing back down. And if he starts to, maybe not have a great month and not play particularly well, are we just going to start blaming it on the back injury again, or is it just going to be kind of a revelation that everybody's realizing, hey, by the way, he's just never going to be Philly Ben Simmons again? And I don't know that Philly Ben Simmons is ever going to come back, but there's a lot of two-way upside and potential here. And the reason that this matters for Brooklyn is when you think about where they've been over the last couple of seasons, getting Harden, getting Kyrie, getting KD, and then all three of those guys getting traded away, you would assume that in the immediate aftermath, the team would not be very good. Last season, after they traded away KD, they were a below 500 team. Went through the coaching change at the beginning of the year, obviously, with Jacques Vaughn now being the head coach. But I actually think they're going to be kind of decent. I think they've got a lot of really good players on the roster. No, superstar, but really, really good guys. And somehow, if Simmons is, let's just say for the sake of argument, let's just say that Ben Simmons goes back to being who he was before he left Philadelphia. Suddenly, the future for Brooklyn looks incredibly bright. You've got Mikal Bridges, you've got Cam Johnson, both those guys on long-term deals. Nick Claxton is someone that I think is going to continue to improve as one of the more underrated defenders in the entire league. And then you add in a still pretty young Ben Simmons to that equation, in addition to all of the draft picks that Brooklyn has as well. There's a lot of possibilities here. There's a reason that they were potentially involved in the Damian Lillard trade situation this past offseason, that reportedly, as things kind of started to open up for Dame, he listed Brooklyn and Milwaukee as two teams in addition to Miami that he would be willing to go to. And the reason for that, I think, is one, Brooklyn had the assets to trade that Portland would potentially be interested in. And also two, if you keep the core together, especially defensively, there's a ton of stuff to like here. And it's honestly pretty incredible to think about the fact that Brooklyn might actually be okay after getting rid of, Kyrie, KD, and Harden. Obviously, it's different when you trade those guys and you actually get value in return rather than them just leaving for nothing in free agency. But apart from when Oklahoma City traded away Paul George and Russell Westbrook, apart from that kind of a situation, we've never really seen a team trade away that level of talent and then get, a ton of assets in return. It's never really happened before, with the exception of there in Oklahoma City. And it's an interesting way to think about team building, right? Where a lot of people said that it ended up being a mistake for Brooklyn to go all in with the Kyrie and the KD experiment, and then of course trade for Harden as well. But when you think about it, if you get those guys on long-term deals, obviously Harden wasn't on a long-term deal, but once you got KD to re-sign and Kyrie and Harden are still both, under contract, even if it does go poorly, and I think we can all agree that once it went bad, it went about as bad as it possibly could in Brooklyn for all three of those guys. Even if that does happen, you can still get a ton in return. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Ben Simmons, and all these future picks is a really, really good haul. Now, obviously the counter counter to that is Brooklyn doesn't have control over its draft assets over the next couple of seasons directly as a result of the Harden trade. Then obviously they end up with Simmons and a couple of Philadelphia picks in exchange. And obviously that's not a great outcome for them, but the possibility still exists here that they could salvage this and maybe even do more than that, especially if Simmons, that part of the equation of that trade for them, getting rid of Harden and getting back Simmons, actually turns out to be a positive for them. And then you account for all the KD assets that they got as well. That's going to be really, really interesting in terms of what that looks like for their future. And this is a team that if you're looking for, the overperformer of the year, a team that, whatever people think they're going to be in the standings, they're actually better than that. Brooklyn is definitely a contender for that, in my opinion, because the talent is there. If they're healthy, offensively, there are going to be nights when they're going to score 90 points and it's going to look really ugly and they're going to be like 3 for 24 from 3 because they don't have a ton of good spacers. That's definitely going to be a thing. But they're also going to have nights where they're going to hold teams to 90 points and they're going to look really good defensively, assuming they can rebound the ball, which has been an issue for them since kind of making Claxton the starting 5 there. But there's no motivation for them to be bad this year. There's not a ton of motivation for a lot of teams to be bad because the draft class isn't very good, but they don't control their own pick this year. And so they might as well try and be good in order for them to not lose out in terms of draft assets. There's really no avenue here for them tanking and trying to be bad. That's not really an option for them. And so I definitely think this is a team that, even though you could maybe argue with, I'm a little bit biased because I'm a Nets fan, I was as down on them last year as I've been on any team pretty much after they traded away Kevin Durant, with the exception obviously of how good Mikal Bridges was. I think you can very easily make an argument that this is a team that is going to overachieve and potentially surprise a lot of people because apart from, some Simmons resurgence here in the preseason, I feel like not a lot of people are talking about Brooklyn. Now, the counter to all this is that this could still go very, very poorly. How well Mikal Bridges played post Kevin Durant trade last year could be complete fool's gold, and it could be something that is just not replicable for him at all. This upcoming season, he might go back to being, a 16, 17 point per game guy as a two-way player. Cam Johnson didn't look great for Team USA. He can shoot the ball, but maybe you think that that's kind of the extent of what he provides for you offensively. As I said, Claxton still struggles as the primary rebounder despite how good he is defensively. And then Simmons is the ultimate wild card. He can have a great first couple of weeks and then look terrible and go back to being the guy that a lot of people thought they might just try and dump the salary of this past offseason. His value got that low for a lot of people, obviously because of the spacing, but a complete lack of confidence in his game overall. It's very easy to see a situation in which Brooklyn wins 30, 35 games this year. If Simmons isn't very good, all of a sudden you're looking at a team that's really just relying on high-level role players as their best guys. I don't think that's what Mikal Bridges is. I think he's better than that, but you could certainly make that argument that a Mikal Bridges-led team for the entirety of the season is right around that 35 win number, which is kind of the pace they were on last year after the KD trade. But again, the biggest wild card, the biggest difference to this is obviously some of the young guys like Claxton, even someone like Cam Thomas, maybe some moves they make if they want to trade away someone like Spencer Dinwiddie. But Ben Simmons, going back to who he was as a real legit possibility for Brooklyn, not only is completely unforeseen, but could completely change the trajectory of not just this season, but what everything looks like for Brooklyn moving forward. And we could look at this team at the deadline or even a year from now as potentially a buyer, as a team that has multiple, future first round picks from Phoenix and Philadelphia, a couple of in Dallas, and actually has plenty of options in terms of bringing in that top tier player. And they're kind of constructed in a way that if you can get a really good guard with this team, there's a real path to a ton of success in Brooklyn. I'm super, super interested to see exactly how things break down for them as we get the season started.